Hi. Thank you. Well, it's so good to be back. Thank you so much. It's so beautiful to see so many familiar faces and some faces that I haven't had a chance to meet as of yet, but I wanted to say thank you, Felice, and thank you, Cam, for really being the bedrock for where I am now. I owe so much to this institution, not only as a curator, having been a curator here, but having grown up in Houston and having laid this museum and the programming here laying a foundation for how I think and move through the world. So there's so much to be grateful for, and I'm very thankful to be back here to talk a little bit about this extraordinary exhibition, which is Nari Ward, We the People. My focus, however, will not so much be on Nari Ward, but sort of the parallels that exist and how we really begin to think about contemporary art and the roots of contemporary art and those practices that run oftentimes in tandem that we don't always discuss. So my focus here will really be about folk art and when and where folk art enters into the conversation. And part of that is informed by two variant things. One, when I first came to Richmond about 2 years ago, it's been 2 years now, one of the first charges I had was to work with the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. The museum had been invited to do a gift purchase exchange with Souls Grown Deep. I had also been contacted by Max Anderson to be on the board of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. So not only was I sort of negotiating this acquisition for the museum, I was also coming on the board of trustees to advocate for this practice. I don't know, many of you probably don't know, but my master's thesis really surrounded this sort of concept of retention and persistence of aesthetic practices as it pertains to African American textiles. So quilts, actually. And so this was very close to my heart, so it gave me an opportunity to come into an institution with a sort of framework that was somewhat familiar, but one that I had been estranged from for a while. But it was wonderful to sort of go back to that space. So a little bit about the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. Bill Arnett is, and his collection is really the repository for the foundation. And it exists to really distribute among museums across the United States and really across the world, the works by African American folk artists. And so Bill Arnett, from the 1980s forward, had gone along the back roads, places Arkansas and Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and back roads of Florida, all across the southern 9 United States cities or states, I'm sorry, to really dig through and go through these spaces to really see this notion of how artists were creating work in the midst of nothingness, you know, away from the markets, away from the big cities and the urban centers, to really see what were the original frameworks of how artists work in these sort of vacuums, because it was there that he really realized that those roots, those bedrocks, were still very much intact. And he wanted to capture that and preserve that. And in that, he created a larger platform by which Americans could then begin to look at these art forms as, in fact, art forms. Because before, it was very pejorative to say an outsider artist or a vernacular artist, which is how I like to discuss these artists and their work, as being very much about the vernacular. A shared communal language is really what vernacular is about. So I really work in the framework of dealing with them as vernacular artists, but most people know them as folk artists. But he wanted to celebrate and preserve their stories and their works. And so he created a massive collection. And so the foundation was established in 2010 to begin to distribute those works to museums, and again, allowing that platform, because I don't know how many of you have seen exhibitions around the women of Gee's Bend, the quilters of Gee's Bend, or the Thornton Dowell exhibitions. These are the artists that Bill Arnett not only acquired their works, but championed their works and created these traveling exhibitions so that Americans would be more aware and cognizant of the practices that existed. So when I came to the VMFA, we had already had two extraordinary works. This work called Freedom Cloth in our collection, as well as this piece called Old Uncle Buck. The Negroes got to know his history. What really moved me in really beginning to think about this collection that we brought in, I brought in 34 works, 6 sculptures by Thorndale, 3 works on paper, 2 paintings, and then of course quilts by the women of Gee's Bend, 4 generations of Petways, and Williams, and in Gee's Bend, which is just south of Birmingham, Alabama. It's about 90 miles south of Birmingham, Alabama. It's now called Boykin, Alabama. So you may hear it referred to as that. What makes that, I'll go back, what makes that work so extraordinary is the fact that these women could literally trace their heritage back to enslaved Africans, that their surnames actually came from the names of plantation owners. And Boykin, Alabama is very interesting because it was very isolated and had been isolated for centuries because there was a river that cut it off from the mainland with only one road in and one road out. So you had large swaths of communities that existed there together. And the women would say, if we're not related to each other by blood, we're certainly related to each other by marriage. So it's there that you could see within these quilts this sort of persistence of aesthetic traditions that had been handed down from one generation to the next for a period of centuries. So that's what makes Gee's Bend quilts really so iconic, because even given that, even given their isolation, their inability to move forward in terms of education opportunities, economic opportunities, this aesthetic tradition persisted and really became so brilliantly created and done that it would rival, the most, profound works of art of modernism. So therein lies that sort of moment. Then how do you begin to bring in these sort of parallel traditions that existed, what I like to call kind of a creative and intuitive genius that is not informed by academic training, but persists in other ways. So clearly the country in the United States, we're already thinking about that. The one thing about contemporary art you realize is everything is quite circular. It always comes back. So what I found in really digging in this research was that as early as 1924, before the Whitney Museum of American Art was a Whitney Museum of American Art, you had someone like Juliana Force, who was already digging into seeing how these parallels existed. What could be the original artistic narrative of America? And so here already in mainstream museums, people were thinking, how could we bring in the original American narratives? Why are we always looking to Europe? We're American. This is a museum of American art. What is the American narrative? We also saw that in the works of Alfred Barr, who was looking at seeds of modernism beyond Europe. And here you see this primitivism exhibition where he was really looking at sculptures to Africa. But we didn't have to go to look at Africa. We could look in our own backyards, right? What I really love about these is this notion of sculpture. You already see what the African traditions, that we're already thinking about assemblage and sculpture as being very influential in modernism. But again, why go to our own backyards? I mean, why go across the ocean when we can go in our own backyard? So when we look at someone as profound as Thorndale and know that he's really the outgrowth of the sort of practices that have existed for long periods of time, and he talks about growing up. Of course, he grew up not in Bessemer, Alabama, but he moved there at the age of 13 or 14 and really planted himself there. What was then really the seed of a lot of steel mills that were happening in Alabama. So the area where he landed was called the Pipe Shop. And he, from that point, began to pick up disparate pieces of metal or wood and create extraordinary things. This is a piece that actually was featured in 2000 at the Whitney Biennial. This is both two pieces that are placed together, Stonewall, which is the painting, and Bad Picture. And this is it again at the VMFA, installed currently with the Cosmologies from the Tree of Life exhibition. So you also see this Foundation of the World, A Dream of My Mother, both separate, and then how it's installed currently in the Cosmologies exhibition, which I organized to highlight our acquisition. And of course, the morning of the end of the world, which was about 9/11. So oftentimes when we think about folk artists, we think of them as being very insular, having this sort of visionary ideal where their universes are only inhabited and understood by themselves or a small group of people. And here Thornton Dial is really quite different. He's atypical in the sense that he is really looking outward into the world and making commentary about what that world is about. And then Tree of Life, in the image of old things, which I took as a part of the title for the exhibition, because it is about the circularity of ideas, about things and universes, and how things flow and then come back. And we'll get to that when it comes to Nari Ward, because of these breathing pieces, which is up against the wall, that are sort of modeled on the Congolese Cosmic Ram, so this notion of circularity. So of course then there is this focus of integrating this work into the larger narrative. So bringing Thornton Dial's work very much like those early two works, Freedom Cloth and Old Uncle Buck. We were always integrating those works into our contemporary art collection. And here, this piece, Birds Don't Care Whose Heads They Crap On, very philosophical in that, which is now placed in our 21st century galleries as well. And of course, more of the two-dimensional relief works of Thornton Dial. What became very interesting to me was to then look at Thornton Dial's work in relation to another artist who arguably was very iconic in the field, and still is, his work at least, Jack Witten, who is also from Bessemer, Alabama. We know Jack Witten as an incredible painter, but if you saw the Odyssey exhibition that was held at the Met, you'd also recognize him as a fairly phenomenal sculptor. And when you think about assemblage and you think about sculpture, the work that he was creating and what he was able to create, not only just in the spirit of bringing these sort of desperate cultures together and materials together, but how he would imbue these objects with ideas, his thoughts. There's a beautiful book, which was basically a log, a kind of personal journal called Notes from the Woodshed, which really harkens back, if you ever had any ideas about what informed Jack Witten's work. Yes, there were contemporary artists, there were practices that we know that stem back from modernism, but it was also the things that he remembered having been born and raised in Bessemer, Alabama. So here are a few works. This work, Homage to Cricri, is on the left. And of course, Jack Witten would go back and forth. He had married a woman who was from Greece, and they would go back and forth every summer to Greece. So he's infusing some cultural identifiers, but also when you think about African sculpture, you think of the Nkisi figures, such as this. When we think about how objects can be transformed, how they are also, again, created to be power objects, how they absorb energies, and how they are the outgrowths of personal beliefs and thoughts. This sort of notion of how you pivot back and forth artistically in this vein is very much at play. notions of accumulation, which are very much at the heart of not only Jack Whitten's work, but Nari Ward's work. So when we think about how do we begin to look at Nari Ward within this sort of spectrum, then we have to look a little bit at his history. Even though he was born in Jamaica and he's transplanted in the United States at a young age, I think 11 or 12, he ends up at Brooklyn College with someone like William T. Williams, who's from North Carolina. And William T. Williams and his smokehouse crew working closely with someone like Mel Edwards, who's Houston-born. And when you think about Mel Edwards' Lynch Fragment series, which are again bringing all of these disparate works to be accumulated onto these little frames, then we began to understand a little bit about Nari Ward's influences, because William T. Williams not only taught him, and Lee Bonteque also was a professor for Nari Ward, again an extraordinary woman out of Providence, Rhode Island, also using things like animal skin and canvas and wires and steel to create large wall relief works. We also know that William T. Williams also introduced Nari Ward to West Coast figures like David Hammons, who is masterful in terms of materiality. We featured this one work in Double Consciousness, a piece called Back Lady in Flight, which is not only paper bags, but it's paper bags that have carried like fried chicken. So it has grease spots and it has a sort of sensory dimensions to it where you could actually smell at times the oil. It also had hair on it, so it had all this texture, again, accumulated onto the surface. We look at other works by David Hammons in terms of form and also a certain politic that's coming into play. These are still beams with books and scales. Again, looking at things like upward mobility, economic mobility, and the sort of clashes that exist in terms of social status, what's available, what are the pathways out of poverty. And he created several works dealing with basketball goals and basketballs in general, the beautiful basketball drawings from asphalt and sand being on the basketball that he threw onto pieces of paper to create these sort of beautiful drawings. Higher goals, which were telephone poles with the sort of backboard, or not backboard, what are these things called? It is a backboard, isn't it? Okay, I got my language right. Never know, I'm not a sports person. But so he's played with this theme quite a bit, of course. And then on the West Coast, you can't really talk about assemblage, you can't really talk about materiality and innovations with that unless you look at people like Noah Purfoy, which I think Franklin Sermons featured in his Neo-Hoodoo exhibition back in 2009 at the Biennial. This is more work by Noah. So clearly, having gone to Brooklyn and subsequently from there to Hunter, you began to think about what all these other influences are coming into play, because at the end of the day, it is about some sort of syncretic mode where artists are always pulling from different fields and different places. Arguably, I want to make an argument to say that folk art is something that Nari Ward would have been aware of and certainly would have known about. And he would have known about artists who draw deeply from those wells. But he was also drawing deeply from things like Arte Povera out of Italy. Whereas Nari Ward were packaging and canning smiles, Here we have Piero Manzoni packaging shit. Of course, people like Janice Cornelis, masterful in terms of materials, using disparate materials to create extraordinary works, monumental works. More of Janice's work. And Art Topova, of course, is pulling on this idea of not precious materials to create artwork, but detritus, trash, things that one could find easily, ordinary materials being elevated. In many ways, that's what assemblage really gets to. It's taking ordinary things and transforming them to be extraordinary things. These are works that are not featured in this iteration, but were featured at the new museum. This piece is called Crusader, and it is basically a shopping cart, which has this sort of armitage that extends it. And then Nari has, of course, woven wonderful canvas and things hanging from it. And if you've ever seen homeless people moving around, you know that they carry their worlds in these shopping carts. And so in many ways, again, it's where he's transforming what is an ordinary object, but also infusing it with this sort of notion of politics, something that's very familiar, but it elevates our understanding of what it means to be homeless and moving through the world. Sky Juice, this notion about the vendors in the Caribbean. Again, taking something ordinary, plain, things that are hiding in plain sight, and creating something quite extraordinary about them, allowing us to see them in a very different way. This piece right behind me, Exodus. One could argue that it's also about immigration. It is about the sort of brain drain that's coming from places like Jamaica or Central America. People are moving forward. And then the extraordinary way that things like, decommissioned fire hoses are used. And we know other artists who are also working with that, people like the Astor Gates. And then, of course, this piece, Amazing Grace, on the other side of the gallery. These abandoned strollers, mostly sourced out of Harlem. I think he may have gotten some few from Brooklyn, but the majority of them out of Harlem. Abandoned strollers making people think, God, how could you abandon a stroller? Well, clearly there's either dysfunction, but of course our minds and our hearts go to ideas around what would happen to the human being inside of that stroller if the stroller had been abandoned. And the fact that there were so many, it really speaks. There was a time when this was done, and when he first installed it in the early 1990s, it was installed in an abandoned fire station, and it inhabited the entirety, 2 floors of this fire station. So one had to walk on, again, these decommissioned fire hoses, very much like you navigate in the far end of the gallery here, to walk around these strollers with Mahalia Jackson's iteration of Amazing Grace being played in the background. So you're aesthetically moved, even though you're looking at what has been detritus, what has been left on the streets that he's pulled together. But in mass, it makes you think about the welfare of the children of that city. It makes you begin to think, again, this is where objects, ordinary objects, can be transformed and move and focus our way of thinking about things that we ordinarily wouldn't. We would just pass by, without a regard of something just lying on the side of the street. And of course, this extraordinary work here, Iron Gate, here using discarded oven, the floors of ovens, and then baseball bats And again, in the early 1990s, when you have cases like, DIU, you have cases where men are being murdered, black men especially are being murdered, and they continue, unfortunately, to be the victims of violence, mistaken identity, mistaken intention. Nari really calls attention to this, really looking at the baseball bat. And at that time, and we're looking at process too, so it isn't just about finding these disparate things and bringing them together. It's how he chars the bats. It's how he, and at the time he was using sugar and affixing things like sugar onto onto the sides of the bat. So you're seeing all of these elements that are really stand-ins for notions about the human body and violence that is being enacted on the human body. But the idea of Heaven's Gate, the fact that he names it Heaven's Gate, really shows this notion of not only his interest in spirituality, not necessarily religious frameworks, but in spirituality. How do we overcome? How do we, very much when you think about folk artists, a lot of their work has been because it's been born out of struggle, it's been born out of lack, it's been born out of suppression and oppression. It's always had the framework of moving beyond. That's what makes the transformative nature of ordinary objects. It's so imbued and it's so melded and woven within the very fabric of how artists are working with these objects. And here Nari is bringing that to bear. And we see this also when we think about other West Coast artists like John Outerbridge, who comes out of Greenville, North Carolina, and moves westward. So we're really looking again about the South and spirituality, looking at things like the bottle tree. We have this beautiful piece right here front and center where Nari is using bottles. In fact, the piece that he showed in Double Consciousness was also this sort of focus on the bottle and messages. The bottle trees are often used to capture evil spirits before they travel into the house. So it's a protective element. We also see this notion of accumulation again in the South with landscape. This is L.V. Hull out of Mississippi. And again, a singular work that's been sort of extracted from the yard installation. Then you also have people like Bessie Harvey, or our very own Cleveland Turner, whose house was unfortunately demolished a few years back. So again, I think Nari's kind of pulling back and forth, drawing upon things. Even though he is Jamaican American, there is a shared experience, and there is this preponderance of how one transforms ordinary objects. So I feel quite strongly that conversation about the intersection of folk art in his work, which hasn't really been taken up, really should be a line of inquiry. But it's also a sort of global understanding of blackness and that shared experience when we look at these breathing pieces that he's created, which comes out of the First Baptist Church, this idea that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and oftentimes the design for the floorboards were such that it had small holes in the floorboards, which during the daytime, as stowaways came, as they escaped and came to that site, they were able to stow away underneath the floorboards during the day, hiding in plain sight. And those small holes were vents from which they could breathe. So that's why that series is called Breathing, quite honestly. It's this notion of how these places function and the histories that they had. But he also likens them to the Congolese Cosmic Ram, which most African Americans can trace if they go to Ancestry.com, can trace their personages, their histories and their legacies, their DNA, all the way back to Togo, to Congo, to Cote d'Ivoire, where, while this is about the Congolese Cosmic Ram, it's about the circularity of life. There's this idea that as one moves around to the highest point, one goes from birth through adulthood, through struggle, that dividing line being water, dividing the physical world from the spiritual world below. And one goes through death underwater and emerges through birth from water to start again. Again, this notion of the circularity of life. And we see this form at the top in Nari Ward's work. So these are thoughts and ideas and beliefs that were literally etched into the bodies of blacks being brought from Africa to this country. We think about syncretic religions, ideas. Think about voodoo out of Nigeria and the Veve. It's not so far-fetched to understand how that persistence of thought really exists even among folk artists. This is the work by Elmer Sewell. It's also her work, her yard work in and around her home, which is really less about accumulation and more about simplicity and form. Emmer, E-M-M-E-R, Sewell, S-E-W-E-L-L. Then, of course, you have the brilliance of Lonnie Holley. I don't know, maybe we can play a little of this music if it will start. He's also a very well-known musician, as would so many. Cannot play media, God darn it. I'll play it at the end. He's also very much like a lot of the folk artists who also infuse music into their work. So whether it's blues or gospel, in this case of Lonnie Holley, he plays an amalgamation of many different musical genres, which you'll hear. And what I loved about it is that first chord, the sort of melody that you hear in the song that we will eventually play, can almost be like music from Dakar. It really does relate back to his sort of sensibility and how he uses sort of melodies and sounds, the sparsity of it, to create a sort of percussive element with the piano and the synthesizer. This is more work by Lonnie Holley called The Fifth Child Burning. And so it's my desire to begin to integrate, very much like we already have at the VMFA, of blending these works together. You could barely see just beyond the silhouette is a Jenny Petway quilt that's hanging in the Minimalist Gallery at the museum. It's primarily what that exhibition, Cosmologies from the Tree of Life, gets to, really looking toward these other tributaries toward modernism and subsequently to contemporary art practices. So that is the presentation, and I just wanted to play you the Lonnie Holley piece if I can get to it. And of course, he's on iTunes, so feel free to follow him. Where are you? Sorry, I'm going to find it eventually. I think it's back on this one. Yep. No, there it is. So it's 11 minutes. It's 13 minutes long, so I don't want to play all of it, but it gives you a sense, and the percussive element are percussive instruments that he's created, so that those sounds that you're hearing are from his own sort of musical sculptures that he's created. So with that, I'll just... It's called The Other Side of the Pulpit. It's the name of the... Oh, and that's not me, by the way. It's called The Other Side of the Pulpit. And I love it because it talks about, again, spirituality, but not from a religious sensibility, but what happens on the other side of that pulpit, what comes from the earth. And so much is about observation, but it's also about knowing what fits so seamlessly with something else to get the biggest impact. Well, thank you all for being so patient and attentive. Appreciate it. Thank you.